Welcome to everyone who's joined us today, both colleagues and our clients. My name is Shirin Tang. I'm the managing partner of Morrison Foerster here in Singapore. And I'm joined by my colleague, Yuka Teraguchi, who is a partner in our Tokyo office. Today's event in Asia is part of a series of events around the globe organized by our firm's Women's Strategy Committee in celebration of International Women's Day. To recognize the social, economic, cultural, and political achievements of women around the world. And the theme for this year's International Women's Day is Break the Bias, which is interesting. And we really got into this discussion among the speakers when we were talking about it yesterday, but recognizing that not just that bias exists, but also sort of a rallying call for conscious action that we can take to address that. And so we're delighted to be joined by two very special guests who are real trailblazers in driving not just gender equality, but equality in all forms. And so I'm going to hand it over to Yuka.
Thanks, Shirin. Well, please join me, everyone, in welcoming Eriko Suzuki, Managing Director of Japan's first ESG-focused venture capital fund, MPower Partners. Eriko has a distinguished career in private equity, venture capital, and investment banking. And in addition to being a managing director of MPower Partners, is founder of the inclusive wellness and sustainability community, Miko Holistic Wellness. She's also the author of a book on the future of work. How we live will be how we work. We are also delighted to welcome Sophie Guerin, who is a recognized expert on diversity and inclusion, and co-author of Examining Diversity and Inclusion from an Asian Perspective. She's co-chair and founding member of the American Chamber of Commerce Singapore Women in Business Committee, and a founding member of its China Women's Professional Committee. Now, before we get started, a quick reminder to everyone to ask questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll try and get to as many questions as possible during this session today. So with that, I'd like to start our discussions by asking Sophie and Eriko about the theme of this year's International Women's Day, Break the Bias. So first, to you, Sophie, what does this theme, Break the Bias, mean to you and when it comes to your career?
Oh, Yuka, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and Shirin as well. I'm just so delighted to be joining MoFo again for a wonderful conversation on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and particularly for International Women's Day. I've just long been an admirer of MoFo's policies and practices in regards to DE&I, and I really appreciate the advancement and commitment that this organization has made on this topic. And it's just such a pleasure to be joining your forum again today. I've been, as we think about the theme for Break the Bias, I've been seeing a number of interesting discussions that have been taking place across the region, been participating in a few myself. And one thing that I thought has really struck me in preparing for conversations around Break the Bias this year is just the level of sophistication I've seen by not just D&I professionals, but active champions of DE&I within their own organizations. Traditionally, what I've seen is that there's been a lot of folks have over the years have needed a lot of preparation in order to come and speak on events around diversity and inclusion and bias. And this year, what I've really noticed is a lot more of open, honest, candid conversations, and folks really having a deep appreciation and understanding for what bias is. And in the course of that conversation, what I've really seen is so interesting about how we break the bias when we think about gender and the advancement, particularly of women into leadership roles, is the intersectionality of issues, particularly around inclusion. Historically, in the DE&I space, we kind of seen a little bit of issue competition between various dimensions of diversity. And what's so refreshing, particularly this year, is the breaking of the bias around the sense that when you lean in to advocate for one group, you're doing that at the loss of another. And that's really not been the theme that I've seen this year, is that the idea is that when we invest in inclusion, all boats rise. And so that to me has been a very, very exciting piece about bias, particularly as we think about advancing DE&I. And I think in addition to that, there's been a much, much deeper understanding and acceptance around the fact that everybody needs to play a role in breaking the bias. It's about understanding your individual biases and being able to talk about that, being able to acknowledge it, and that we all have a role to play in coming together to challenging these biases. It's not just about women doing more, leaning in more, speaking up more, dreaming more, thinking bigger, but it's really about looking at the ecosystem in which we operate and making sure that each one of us are challenging our own behaviors, but also really examining those systems and saying, what can we do to tackle those issues holistically so we can target systemic bias within the organizations and the systems in which we live. So it's a much deeper, richer conversation, particularly this year. And it just says to me that we are making progress, though at times, sometimes it might feel slow. As somebody who's been in the space for 15 years, I've been really blown away this year for what we're seeing in terms of conversations around challenging bias.
Thank you. That's an inspiring and insightful comment on this year's theme. Eriko, can we hear from you as well on what you think about this year's theme?
Yes, thank you. Thank you again, Yuka-san and Shirin-san, for the introduction as well. I feel really honored to be joining this panel. And I also want to echo a lot of Sophie's points. But yes, to me, breaking the bias is a great theme this year, especially as I'm part of a venture capital and I work in tech and the intersection of tech and finance. And to be very honest, I think tech and finance are still some of the frontiers when it comes to DE&I. And I can get back to that a little bit later. But in terms of echoing what Sophie said, I also as an ESG fund, see that the literacy around DEI across the board in all sectors, in all types of companies or organizations has risen. So people are much more comfortable or willing to discuss DE&I, gender diversity, equity, and inclusion, and people have an awareness that this is an important issue. So it's so different from several years ago when people didn't really want to talk about it. Just seeing so many International Women's Day events held by various types of corporations, whether it's in the professional firms or CPG firms, it's just incredible. So I do think it's progressing. But then again, I want to get back to the tech and finance sector where it's still a lot of gaps between the gender in terms of, for example, less than 5% of global venture capital funding is really going to female founders. That type of statistic has come out, over the last 5 or so years, and year on year, it hasn't drastically improved. Unfortunately, the absolute amount has gone up with riding the tide of the startup venture capital investment. So you might see, oh, this female founder raised, $10-20 million, or this female founder listed on the IPO, public markets. But so in absolute terms, yes, we're seeing those examples, but unfortunately, by percentages, it's still very, very small, because the entire startup sector has been growing, which is a good thing. And so there's still so much we can do. And on this other side, there's always the investment part. So for investors as well, the venture capital side, less than 10% of decision-making people on the firms, like partners, et cetera, less than 10% are diverse, in terms of gender. And when it comes to, globally, more, racial diversity, it's much, much lower. So if it's Latinx or BIPOC venture capitalists, it's less than 5%. So I feel like there's still more to do. And I want to maybe end this part of this answer with, always keeping an open mind. And, there's a lot we can do in this area of, diversity and gender. And even myself, I'm always learning. I feel like, I want to be self-aware and I want to know where I can improve. And that really, for me, is core to what a venture capitalist does as a profession as well. So we always want to keep an open mind, and there's always potential for, a new type of market to spring up. And I try to approach D&I as well in that way, be very open-minded, I'm willing to learn if there's things that I can do differently. And so, yeah, I think that would be it for now. Thank you.
Oh, thanks very much, Eriko. I mean, there's so much to unpack there. I'm not even sure like where we go next from here. I think, you know, you sort of framed very nicely some of the bias, right? So like investment bias, glass ceiling type stuff. And then there's so much other stuff. So when Yuka and I were talking about the theme, we are like, what bias, right? We just put our heads down and get things done. Like, how do you unpack the bias? And this is already coming out here. I mean, so it's been said a lot, and I think the theme has really helped bring that out. But so, you know, I'll give you an anecdote. My son's father, who's actually dialed in, he's senior in-house counsel at a bank. But my son's father, he posted something yesterday in celebration of International Women's Day about the challenges of working and raising a child, right? And that's, I mean, one form of bias if you think about it, even though it might not be a conscious bias. You know, that there were things like there's, you know, first of all, there's the glass ceiling, then there's also maternity, there's societal expectations, gender roles, like the social construct, right? And another senior in-house counsel, a woman that I admire greatly, she posted on LinkedIn yesterday saying that she found herself, in terms of like our own consciousness and our own bias, she said she found herself asking another successful woman how she juggles, you know, her job and multiple children, and did not think to ask the same question of a man, right? And so that is, you know, our own gender bias. And so I guess I'll direct it to Sophie, but sort of, you know, other sort of specific biases or that, you know, or challenges that you've had to overcome in your career, or the other way around, you know, are there biases that you have found yourself sort of catching yourself and going, hang on?
Yeah, I've got two. I mean, I can start with my own experience. You know, I moved to Asia when I was very young. I was about 19, and I really didn't have much professional experience, obviously, as someone so young. And this was in the early 2000s, and trying to get my foot in the door as a young foreign woman in mainland China at that time was very difficult. And to be taken seriously in business circles was incredibly challenging, particularly because I didn't have a business background. So it really just, I had kind of one thing against me after the other. And I was in several, you know, and at the time, there was no conversations around diversity and inclusion. And I was in several experiences that made me quite uncomfortable. And I had some very conversations now, which would be completely unacceptable with individuals as part of the interview process. And so that was really demoralizing as a young person, and really just wanting to work hard and showcase and, you know, my skills and ability. And I knew I was willing to do whatever it took to be successful and to work hard. But it was clear to me that there were cultural issues in many businesses that I just really wasn't prepared for, and I didn't know how to handle as a young professional. And so I found it difficult to find kind of the right opportunity to get started and to build some credibility. And I have to say, I'm really grateful. Yuka, you had mentioned in my bio about starting the women's committee in China, and that's really where I got my start. Was I found a group of women business executives who were looking to start a women's professional committee through the American Chamber of Commerce. And they were the ones that gave me a chance. And they were the ones that gave me an opportunity in a safe space to build some professional expertise and to prove myself so that I could go out with more confidence and to be able to say, look at what I've achieved, and to be able to be taken more seriously and to be able to feel more confident in many of those interviews and situations. So that was really, as a young person, very, very difficult at that time. I think in terms of my own biases, I think I shared a little bit around this. I have been doing some work particularly around how do we challenge the ecosystem in which we operate in so that we can enable men and women to be successful. And so we were looking particularly around paternity leave policy and maternity leave policy. We're making a shift to parental leave policy. But in order to do that, we needed to encourage more men to take the leave. And so I was working with our commercial head for one of our major markets here in the region. This was in a previous organization. And I had made a passing comment around that we really needed to role model and encourage young men to take on these policies, because once they took those leaves, we'd start to equalize kind of our assumptions about people at certain stages in their lives, and they were planning on having a family and whether or not we should hire them because they may or may not take this leave. And he was an older gentleman from the region, and I made a comment. I said, young men these days, they want to take advantage of leave, and this is something that millennials are asking for, and we need to make sure that we're encouraging it. It's a generational shift. And he said, hold up. He said, I came up in a very different time. And when I was a young man here in the region, I, had my family. Family's very important to me. And I would have loved to take leave. I would have loved to have been there when my kids were growing up. And, when my partner, needed help around the house, when our children were very young, very, very newborn. And I wanted to take that time off in particular and be able to spend time with them on the weekends and after work. And so that just wasn't an option. Culturally, it wasn't an option. That was, gender roles were very clear. And he said, you have to be really careful about those assumptions that you're making, because just because we're in different generations doesn't mean that we don't want to be parents, that we don't want to be active, fathers or mothers. It's just that cultural norms have shifted, and these conversations are now permissible. So don't make that assumption about myself or about other generations. And I stepped back and I realized, hold up, I really need to be careful about what I'm projecting onto people, and making sure I'm asking questions first and I'm listening, rather than making broad assumptions about people's generational differences, particularly here in this region, where we can easily fall into saying, okay, well, it's gender norms or generational differences. It's an easy broad strokes, but that might not always be the case. And if you don't stop to ask the questions, you might not necessarily engage people to be your partners and advocates, which you could. And then you might not also be approaching it in the way that's going to be most effective for driving change. So that was for me a real aha moment, and I think really changed how I saw how I needed to drive DE&I here in this region.
That's a great story, Sophie. You actually made me realize that I myself have some unconscious bias against these so-called generation gaps, because we often talk about how the older generation views work-life balance this way, as opposed to how the new college graduates view it this way. And I realized from your story that that's the unconscious bias I really need to be aware of in interviewing candidates, for example. So thank you for that. And Sophie and Eriko, you both mentioned that when we talked about this year's theme, that there's been more candid, open discussions about it. But you also both mentioned that there's a long way to go in achieving diversity and inclusion in our workplace and elsewhere. So I want to talk a little bit about how to get there. So maybe, Eriko, first I can address my question to you, is that how do you lead or influence other people to make those changes? How do you affect change in the stakeholders?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I'm coming to this question from a viewpoint of a venture capital firm that is ESG integrated. So we help our portfolios in terms of D&I. So I have that thought in my head. And I also have, just as a female venture capitalist, how can I empower more venture capitalists that are diverse? How can I empower more founders, not only our portfolio companies? So I'm coming from that perspective. But yeah, the stakeholder, how to influence the stakeholders is such a great question. I think dialogue is very important, and so just putting it on the table and discussing about it itself is very, very helpful. I know we started today saying that there's a lot going on right now. International Women's Day is more at the forefront. So I think that's great. And so bringing it to the table even more and having some clear kind of goals or frameworks around it, I think also helps the conversation. And it doesn't have to be stringent. It doesn't have to be a quota type discussion. I know it can be very sensitive and difficult to have, but just measuring it, seeing, where are we at in terms of, gender diversity and other types of diversity in this organization, or as, a group of professions like perhaps law or, venture capital, where are we? Seeing those metrics really helps. And then we can identify, oh, wow, it's actually, low in this area, but perhaps high in this area. And so I think having those metrics can really be helpful. So that's one. And the other one is just doing things. And especially coming from Japan, where we are primarily based, even though I've made, investments globally in my past as well, and at MPowers as well. In Japan or in Asia, perhaps, we always hear of what's the precedence, how has it been done before? And having that mindset is just quite contrary to these types of progressive, collective movements. And so I think it's important to say that, we need to get out of the mindset of, is there a precedence? Who else has done this? So, start taking small steps, even if it's small, just doing it. And so I really enjoyed what Sophie said, some of the female groups gave her a chance, it's that one chance, that one trial that can really help move things forward. And I think we often, corporations, etc., strive for kind of a perfect outcome, but doing things and adjusting along the way is very much a startup entrepreneurial mindset, and I'd love to share that more with these types of initiatives as well.
Thank you, Eriko. Yeah, as you said, we need to start somewhere, and bringing the discussion topic on the table is definitely a start. Sophie, I'm sure you, Shirin.
I was just going to say, this is a nice segue, because we've just had an audience question. I think someone thought of as Eriko was speaking, but so maybe I'll start with this one with Sophie. Like, have you come across any confrontation related to gender bias, and how did you solve that? What was your experience?
This is the art of the D&I role. It's not just gender bias. It's all sorts of, the reality is change is challenging, right? If it was easy, we would all do it. And yes, I meet conflict, I meet pushback in many different ways. There's and challenge shows up in many different forms, right? You've got people who say, I don't see that there's a problem at all. You've got people, especially around gender, who will say, well, this is unfair. This is in conflict with meritocracy. Some people will say this is just lip service. You've got there are other forms that become very confrontational about, that can be more around kind of gamesmanship around D&I. So, kind of more talking at you about how things should be rather than working with you to make those progress. It really just depends. Everybody's got a slightly different agenda when it comes to some of this work, and have very different understandings and very different approaches to it. Usually, my job is, I kind of think about a D&I role is I'm a consultant for one company, right? And my job is to understand my stakeholders, to understand their priorities, and to figure out how do we help bridge our objectives as an organization and connect that with the needs of our business leaders. And so usually when I start in my role, I spend the first 6 months simply understanding my stakeholders. What are their businesses? What are their needs? What are their concerns? What are their opportunities? What does the business outlook look like for the next 3 to 5 years? I don't really actually talk that much about D&I. If they want to talk about it, that's fine. But I really just build trust and get to know them and their concerns. Because when I get back to it, is I always like to think about what's the objective of diversity and inclusion, particularly in a private sector organization, right? Our job is to enable business success. And we do that through diversity and inclusion initiatives, policies, and practices that enable talent success and enable customer success. And so when you can come at it from that perspective, one, I think it helps you to be more strategic as a partner and advisor on diversity and inclusion, and it helps you to deliver better outcomes, right? And I think more often than not is that leadership, when you encounter leadership challenge or resistance to diversity and inclusion, it's often because those two dots have not been joined. And so my job is to help do that for them, or to help them understand that, and to figure out where we can help make that connection. Now, yes, there have been cases where I have not been able to do that successfully, but I've found with experience and time, I'm getting better and better. And there are different interventions that you can do. One is you need to make sure you've got accountability from the top. If you don't have that, it is frankly can be very challenging to make progress, right? You have to have, I think the organization needs to have your back and to be supportive in order for you to come in with the consulting expertise or the champion expertise, and then to have the organization. You can also do peer-to-peer engagement. So sometimes as the D&I leader, I do realize that people speak differently to me than they do to other people because, oh, it's the D&I person, I've got to get my words right, So I'm aware that people manage themselves when they're around me. So sometimes I might go to a business leader that I've got a good relationship with, and I'll say, hey, I'm having a little challenge here. Could you help me to talk to them? Or what insight do you have? Other times I might need to talk to somebody's, supervisor or leader and have that conversation. It really just depends on that individual and that approach, but really more than anything is I try to talk through their individual concerns and then see how we could help to address that. And then in the end, reinforce we're here to deliver business outcomes and business success, which is what hopefully leaders in most organizations should be driving towards. And so I try to speak to them in that way in an area they feel comfortable with, so we can drive the outcomes in DE&I that will help enable their business success.
Got it. Thanks very much, Sophie. Actually, as a related question, so, I think these themes are interesting, the leadership theme, because, like you were saying yesterday when we talked about it, Eriko's role and yours are very different, right? Because so you have a team that you can lead and sort of say that we're going to do this. And then for Sophie, yours, you were saying yours is not so much, it's not necessarily that you can order people to do things, but it's like influence, right? And so you just spoke about how you do this in your role, sort of seeing yourself as a consultant, sort of influencing, the business leaders. We have a lot of our colleagues on from Morrison and Foerster. Like what advice would you give for someone that was keenly interested in promoting DE&I, right? But not necessarily they don't wear the hat of a DE&I person, and they are not, partners in the firm, right? How do they? So not necessarily the leadership, but the influence, or what advice do you have for like peers, right?
Yeah. Do you want me to jump in on this?
Yes, for Sophie.
Yeah,
please.
sure. So I often will get this. So I speak to a lot of people who say, and especially people who kind of have this usually happens mid-career, where it's like, I want to have purpose in my career. And while I've enjoyed what I've done, I don't feel like I'm giving back in the way that I'd really like to. And so I want to move into a CSR or D&I role because I want to have more purpose and meaning, and I want to be able to impact change. And I think I always push back a little bit on that, because especially if people who are in position who do have some degree of influence, it's always helpful to think about what can you do in the role that you have now. So regardless of where you sit, especially if you're in a P&L role, you have tremendous influence. You have the ability to influence hiring, with the ability to influence norms and practices within your team. It may seem small, but that's where change starts, right? So I do think I'd always encourage, well, what are you doing now within your own organization? Because when you're in a role like mine, it is about influencing from the sidelines, right? And it's very different because we're trying to influence our leaders, our individuals, our middle managers to drive the changes that we want to see. So that's one thing. I think there are great things like employee resource groups are wonderful ways to get involved in driving change. You can look at how can you influence some of your community engagements or community partnerships. Oftentimes, organizations who are still kind of young in their DE&I journey, they might not have employee resource groups. It's reaching out to and engaging in HR, or if you're finding resistance to HR, your commercial leadership, and say, hey, I want to bring a forum together to talk about issues like LGBT inclusion or gender or what have you. I'd love to get your support. And if you really still can't find that internally, you can look at external forums. There are things like the American Chamber of Commerce, which I'm involved in, but there are many other business forums and platforms that are out there. There are also NGO organizations who can get involved. And so I just encourage folks to start thinking about, what are you doing now? How can you get involved in what's being offered today? If you don't see what you want, who can you speak with in your organization to get that off the ground? If you're still finding challenge, where can you go in your community to make those impact? And that's one of the things that I've always done. When I'm in a D&I role, I'm saying, what more can I do to influence others, to galvanize others to come with me on this journey?
Right. Oh, Shirin, do you want to say something first?
No, I was just nodding along in agreement, but I'm going to hand it over to you now, Yuka.
Sure. As you both said, this is definitely a group effort, not something that one individual person can change, but those who are interested and who are motivated to make those changes can get together and influence others or lead others to make those changes come true. Eriko, on that note, I wanted to talk about the importance of community, the group that you can rely on, that you can work together to make this change about. Can you talk a little bit about how you leverage your community in this role?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, I think it's, the peer aspect, I think was mentioned before, and this community is very, very important. A lot of these DEI initiatives, like the questioners have asked, sometimes it's challenging and there's confrontation. And so what do you do? And it's great to share information amongst your peers in a constructive way, because then you realize, oh, this is not just happening to you, but it's happening in other workforces, and not just happening in your industry, but it's cross industry. And so having that, information sharing kind of safe space to be vulnerable, and also that your, information is confidential, and people are not, here to judge or say this is the solution you need to go by, but just simply first listening and empathizing with each other is very important. So I've personally created a community like that in Japan, because I didn't necessarily see one for kind of women in mid-career levels, etc. So I think that's very important. And yeah, I think what else can we say? Just it's very interesting how it seems like different challenges, but a lot of it is quite similar to each other. So just noticing that. And so I would encourage everybody to have some form of community, and it can be quite small in the beginning. It doesn't have to be a very structured thing to be part of a certain organization, but just talk amongst your peers. And I think when we were preparing for this session, I shared a concept that my mentor and my colleagues in MPower have shared with me, that to have a board of directors in your mind, so people you can depend on for different topics when you're facing certain challenges or making key career move decisions, etc. It's really great to have that diversified board of directors to go to.
The concept of having your own board of directors definitely resonates with me. Having various people that you can go to, not just a single role model. So, Eriko, on discussing community, this I'm sure applies to the rest of Asia as well, but also in particular in Japan. A lot of people who are successful have connections from the get-go. They might have family connections, for example. I was wondering if you also agree with the view, and also if you do, if you've seen any efforts to encourage those who have particular influence in the industry to mentor or sponsor women who might not actually have that family connections to begin with.
Yes, yeah, thank you for that question from the audience as well. I think perhaps it is more so in Asia compared to the West, etc. But connections, I think, globally are so important. And connections are important not just for kind of name dropping. I think, we all realize that, but really for that trust factor, being trusted and opening doors. And so it's a shame if, certain parts of the community or the are based on gender, they're not accessing that. And so I think accessibility to this is very important. But as as we all know, some women or different types of groups don't have access to that. And so I've seen people come together to offer mentorship and pay it forward to the next generation. I think that has worked in certain cases. But what I tend to encourage in this day and age is it's actually possible to make that type of connection or have that type of mentorship more easily than you might think if we reach out actively to people. We have LinkedIn, we have social media now, we have Twitter. And so it is possible to do so one-on-one. I think it is quite daunting at first, but once you have that one person, it does become a network effect where they introduce you to more and more people. And so I would encourage people to try and make that outbound reach. And I'm sure many of the people listening on this panel and discussion are very talented, so they have something to offer as well. So I would always start with a place of work. What can they give first when they would request some type of mentorship, etc. So I'd love to encourage those types of movements.
Thank you, Eriko.
So along the themes of, what I guess, so Eriko's been talking about what each of us can do sort of to build our own communities. Also wanted to go back to a theme that Sophie mentioned, because we got an audience question sort of from the other perspective, right? Not just what we can do ourselves, but sort of within the organizations. Someone asked, Sophie, you mentioned the need for accountability in increasing diversity. What suggestions do you have for creating accountability for individuals and or corporations?
Yeah, so I think for most organizations these days, there's usually large ambitious goals around how an organization wants to improve diversity within their own organization. I think that's increasingly the norm for companies to be able to take a look at what is their representation within the market and then within their own organization, and where do they want to go? As you would with any other element of your business, you would say, where do I think things are going? What do I think we can achieve? Let's push it a little bit more, and that's what we're going to aim for. That is increasingly the norm. So that's the starting point, and that gives people kind of a North Star in which to aim towards. And then within that, you need to have capabilities within your organization to kind of have goals that can roll up to that. So, okay, you've put that out there. Now, how are you going to do it, right? And so, most organizations these days, and what I would encourage companies to do is make sure, you've got your CEO owning and driving that. Their next click down have very clear goals in terms of what they need to achieve. And then that gets rolled down throughout the organization. So at J&J, for example, we have our Health for Humanity goals. So we've got very clear public goals towards 2020-2025. Each of our VPs gets scorecards, both on diversity as well as inclusion, because that's really important. Because the flip side sometimes of diversity accountability, if you don't invest in inclusion, is that it can become this perception, well, it's a tick box, or this runs at odds with meritocracy. So you need to hold accountability on both ends, right? And that's where things like employee engagement surveys, pulse surveys become really important. And then what we have now is that all people managers are required in their annual goals and objectives they have on Workday, we have a thing where you have to set a diversity and inclusion goal. And we have a toolkit that tells you how to do that and can gives you 4 areas where we suggest you put a goal, and that you have to have that in your mid-year review with your manager and at your end of year. And then we've made it optional for individual contributors to put that in there. And what we found is huge. We introduced it for the first time this last year for non-VP populations. And it was incredible. The take-up rate for individuals who had it as an optional goal was well beyond what we expected. And it's been very, very positive. And in fact, now one of the things that it does is it'll affect your performance assessment for VPs. So you can, if you achieve your business goals, but you don't hit your DE&I goals, you cannot achieve and exceeds without CEO exceptional approval. And so as a result, very few people get that if they do at all. So we've made it very, very clear that this is an expectation within our organization, and it's part of the sustainability of our organization. As we talk a little bit around ESG, right? This is the reality of where business is going. You look at what the Business Roundtable has done about defining what is the purpose of a company. It's beyond simply shareholder value. It's understanding our role in broader ecosystem. So this is where companies really need to kind of make sure they put rubber hits the road on this, and you've got to get systems and buy-in to make that happen. But that's where you start to move progress. You can measure other things within your organization as well to help make sure that those goals are supported. But yeah, I think really tying it to annual performance and D&I have to go hand in hand.
Thank you, Sophie. It's great to hear how companies, multinational companies like J&J, try to achieve diversity and inclusion by putting this framework together so that people can set their goals and you can evaluate their achievement, how much they've achieved towards that goal. So, follow-up question I have is, so multinational organizations deal with diversity inclusion globally. But from my personal experience, diversity in the United States might be a bit quite different from diversity in Asia, for example. Example, if you want a diverse team in US, maybe you look at gender diversity and racial diversity and other types of diversity. But if you have an Asia team, the racial diversity is, I'm not quite sure how you evaluate that. And so there are different types of diversity that I'm sure companies will need to look at depending on which region you're in. So I want to, given that we're all in Asia, I want to discuss a little bit more about diversity in Asia. So, I think we all agree that there's a long way to go, but if you can tell us your view on how Asia compares to other countries in terms of diversity and inclusion, that would be fantastic. Maybe I can start with you, Eriko.
Yeah, sure. I would love to, get everyone's thoughts on this as well. So I think we all realize that Asia, or particularly, within Asia, maybe Japan, there are areas where, we are behind. And I think it's, the social and historical context is affecting it in terms of, even unconscious biases. There's a lot to tackle in Japan, but we are seeing progress. So I want to remain optimistic. I think it's thanks to having these dialogues and thanks to having, people putting it on the, prioritizing it on their agendas more and more. So it is progressing. So I think that's great. And in Japan, I think what's helping is that, no longer saying that this D&I initiative is a Western thing only, realizing that it is a truly global movement, I think is helping it move forward. Before maybe 5-10 years ago, there was a lot of conceptualization that it's just not going to happen in Japan. But with the rise of ESG and rise of, being a true globalized company, even with sitting within Japan, to playing at those global standards, I think people are increasingly realizing this is really a must-have priority. So, people are no longer seeing it as it's just something of the West. So I'm encouraged by that. And at the same time, I'm hoping that there will be an essence, very localized essence coming out of Japan. Japan is a very aging society, as you all know. And I think there are certain areas that certain issues that Japan will face much earlier than the global population. And I think it's not necessarily perhaps gender, but I think it's important that Japan leads those solutions, especially for elderly care. If that burden is going on to women more than others, that's something we need to tackle. And I think the elderly care is falling upon, working male business people as well. And I think that's all something we need to think about. And it would be great if Japan can be, a leader, a thought leader there.
Yeah.
Sophie.
Yeah.
Sophie. Please go ahead. Please jump in.
Eriko-san, I couldn't agree with you more. I'm really glad you brought up the issue of aging. I think, that's something I'm really passionate about. We've recently started an aging business roundtable to help elevate this conversation among private sector companies, to really think also about employment of an aging workforce. I mean, 40% of North Asia will be over the age of 60 by 2050. I mean, this is huge. We have traditionally thought about younger populations in Asia Pacific, which are very, very important for engaging. But the reality is that the majority of significant representation of our workforce will be an aging one over the next several decades. And so we need to prepare now as companies for that. And when we think about where we can lead in DE&I here in our region, age is one of those things. I think this is leading to a kind of a broader question, though, about a little bit around the legacy of DE&I. Diversity, equity, inclusion largely has been driven by Western multinationals who've had this as part of their companies, due to US federal regulations. And so much of that conversation, the reason why so much of it is Western centric is that that's kind of where the history of these conversations have come out of. And as a result, we're only just now starting to put in systems in place to begin to measure diversity here in regions outside of the United States that are relevant for the communities in which we live in. And so when we think about, Yuka, you had mentioned a little bit some of the research I had done previously, where we tried to look at what were those dimensions of difference when people organically bring them up. So we did focus groups and surveys, and things that we found that were the biggest areas of unconscious bias here in Asia. Whereas, yes, gender came up, but it was overseas experience. It was language. It was urban versus rural. Where did you grow up? Where was your background, your networks, your connections, what educational institute did you go to? So those, and then seniority and hierarchy, I think a little bit the generational piece, right? So those were the issues that were really seen as barriers to a more equitable and inclusive environment, right? And so with that in mind, I think, especially for, local firms that are increasingly instituting diversity and inclusion into their own organizations, I think there's a really exciting opportunity for local firms to be able to lead with it, really lead on the Asian front in terms of driving diversity and inclusion initiatives and policies and measurement that is reflective of some of those areas of systemic inequality here in our communities. So that's a really interesting opportunity for us to, when we think about, again, driving, better performance in our teams, driving better outcomes for our customers, we need to make sure we're addressing those issues of bias here in our region, right? And so there's work looking around how do we make sure that we are multilingual? How do we think about, especially for Western multinationals, one of the things that we often say is you have to be able to speak English if you're moving into a leadership position. Do you? Are there things that we can do now? We have technology in place. Like why does that have to be the barrier, right? And especially if we look at emerging economies, are we missing out on talent because of that? And so that just has to make us rethink a little bit around our organization. And the whole bias around the universities is huge. And especially if we look at markets like India and China, I mean, if you're only hiring from 5 universities, you're very much limiting your talent pool. And are you setting yourself up for success in emerging, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 cities? Probably not, so those are some things that we can think about for driving more relevant DE&I, but it's very exciting space here for that, for DE&I to think about.
So I've got a follow-on question for Sophie, and then I've got one for Eriko, just because I'm super curious about this. But just so I guess, Sophie, in your, you work in it's a global organization, right? And so you're talking about how, like, in the local firms, we can really drive being more specific and sort of considered about how we see DE&I in this region. I think yesterday when we were talking about this, you were saying it's sometimes for global organizations, it's hard to gain traction in this part of the world because you're trying to drive global issues like from somewhere else. And so it's without making it super relevant, to this region. I guess so having identified and spoken, both you and Eriko, about sort of the really specific issues that we face in this region, and even in this region, it's not homogenous by any means. How for global organizations, sort of where these efforts may be led from elsewhere, how do you recommend? Do you have any recommendations and suggestions for how to?
Yeah, so one of the things that I do at J&J is I look at what our global objectives are. I look at our global pillars, and then I do as I conduct interviews across the region with our commercial and our HR partners to understand what are our biggest challenges and opportunities when we think about our growth of our business over the next 3 to 5 years. And then from that, I kind of pick the areas that I know that DE&I can influence in, and I put kind of not global level, that high level or that abstract of goals at a global level, but I kind of bring it down a little bit so it's a little bit more tangible and a little bit more like clearly executable. at a local level. And I put some kind of high level objectives that I know we need to move the needle on in the region, but there's a lot of flexibility for people to contextualize for their local markets. So thinking about, for example, one of our goals right now is we know we have ERGs, our best sources of knowledge and insight around issues, how some of these issues play out on the ground, right? They know their market. Like in the Philippines, for example, the ERG in the Philippines knows their market better than I do. I'm not in the Philippines. I didn't grow up in the Philippines. I just don't know it as well. So it's giving them some goals and some objectives, like how do you elevate your ERG to be an effective talent partner for our business? Now, they know now that their goal, the goal is, okay, you need to elevate the ERG to be a talent partner, which means you're going to need to have more structured programs around talent development in place, around talent engagement in place. But how you do that is up to you, right? And so giving people that ability to localize and to lead with the knowledge that they have about the market, but then to help teams identify what are high-level goals across our organization that we know we need to drive in order to make progress for our business. So it's giving people a collective North Star, kind of clear goals that we need to aim towards, but then the tactic itself, they have the freedom to customize and drive, right? And I think that's the healthy balance and the equilibrium, which I think is also somewhat reflective in many commercial spaces as well. But you know, it's recognizing that your team knows their market and working in partnership together.
Like actually nodding away, because I think this is really useful for us as well, just within the firm and how we try and drive some of this stuff. Great. So I've got a question that this is just a personal question for me because of Eriko's background. That's super interesting. And so, you know, Eriko's your hard charging venture capital, private equity, but then you are also the founder of a wellness and sustainability community, right? Miko Holistic Wellness. And so for me, I love that because I feel like it's all different sides of the same coin. You know, Yuka and I, we're not just on the Women's Strategy Committee, we're also on the Mental Health Steering Committee, right? And it's, for me, you know, maybe it's our gender roles, maybe whatever it is, it's never just the one thing that is just too much. It's always, it's career, and then like, oh my God, my son has exams, and then like I need to bring my parents to a medical appointment and all of that. So, you know, I'm curious to hear your thoughts, Eriko, about how sort of for you, you know, how you link up, you know, just the bias or the gender bias, whatever sort of bias we're talking about, the challenges that women face, but also this holistic wellness community that you founded.
Yes, thank you so much for your interest, and I can, you know, sense it already. But and you described it the way I see it too, which is it's all very connected. So I've been in the finance space for, you know, 15 years, and I've also been in the social impact space as well. So that I worked in that intersection. But it's the base drive for me is, you know, seeing kind of a more positive world, and I think many of us have that, you know, very basic purpose and desire. And a couple of years ago, I really felt like it's all connected. So, you know, gender, diversity, sustainability, the way we treat our resources, our global, limited resources, the way businesses are run, I just felt like they're so interconnected. And I wanted to have more information about those connectivities and see how we can work as a community and as people around these areas. And I didn't necessarily find that, and holistic wellness was a great way because each individual is also thriving for their individual wellness, but at the same time, it's connected to the collective wellness. And so that's how it started. And it's been an honor and really great to work in this space because with COVID, it became forefront that our wellness is important. I think many people have realized that in not just our health standards kind of physically, but our mental health as well. And I'm so glad and excited to hear that you're part of the Mental Health Steering Committee. But that's the basis of our working lives and also our familial lives. And there's not a lot of resources out there yet, but I think with increasing initiatives, it will become more accessible. So to me, they're all connected. And I think I'd love to get more people talking about this, because then it makes it a truly aligned, accountable movement, whether it's D&I or sustainability. It's not just check the box activities, but when you think about it, they're all really connected, and you want to get to the kind of core of it so that we can systematically change it.
I love how we've gone. I'm going to hand it back to Yuka, but I just love how we've gone. We went from gender bias and International Women's Day to talking about ageism and all kinds of bias. And then here we are connecting all of it, in a way that totally makes sense. So I love that. Sorry,
This has been, no, this has been very inspirational and encouraging at the same time, and also getting practice advice on how to move D&I forward. Shirin and I will definitely take this back to our committees within MoFo to drive this forward from Asia and also firm-wide as well. So thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are running close to time, so I would like to take this opportunity to draw attention to our discussion to a close, and to thank Eriko and Sophie for being our guests today, for being wonderful guests today. I think we can agree that both Eriko and Sophie have have shared their experience and insights very candidly. We appreciate that so much. I know I personally have learned a lot from our discussions.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this. There have been so many International Women's Day webinars, but I feel like this one, we sort of went beyond International Women's Day here, right? So this is great. And thank you so much again to Eriko and Sophie. And also thank you to everyone else who joined us, both our colleagues and our clients. Just to say that this webinar is part of MoFo Asia's diversity and inclusion series. So I love that we went beyond women here. And please look out for our future events. I think the next big one we're planning is in June for Pride Month. So thank you once again.